What if I told you that a single social media post could promise $2,000 to millions of Americans and simultaneously expose the deepest fractures in the nation's economic policy? And what if that promise, while politically brilliant, was also mathematically impossible, legislatively dead on arrival, and based on funding that could be erased overnight by the Supreme Court? In the complex and often turbulent political theater of 2025, a few events managed to capture the public's attention and spark as much debate as the sudden promise of a $2,000 dividend. The announcement, emerging directly from President Donald Trump on November 9th, 2025, set off a whirlwind of analysis, administrative confusion, sharp criticism, and profound questions of feasibility. It was a proposal that touched upon the most sensitive nerves of the American economy: national debt, inflation, congressional authority, and the fundamental mathematics of federal revenue versus spending. What began as a declarative promise quickly unraveled into a case study of political messaging versus economic reality, culminating in a high stakes legal cliffhanger before the Supreme Court. This is the detailed anatomy of that promise, from its inception to its myriad challenges. So let's start at the beginning with the initial promise itself, that $2,000 tariff dividend. The event began, as many administration defining moments did, not through a formal White House press release, but via a direct dispatch on the Truth Social platform. On Sunday, November 9th, 2025, President Trump issued a statement that was both bold and unambiguous. He officially confirmed and personally promised what he termed a dividend, a stimulus check to be funded by revenue from his administration's aggressive tariff policies. The specifics of this promise were, at first glance, strikingly clear. The amount was specified as at least $2,000 a person. This was not a household benefit, but a per capita payment. The recipients were defined broadly. The dividend will be paid to everyone, with the immediate and notable clarification not including high income people. Though high income was not defined, the message was targeted squarely at the middle and working classes. This promise was not delivered in a vacuum. It was embedded within a broader, triumphant narrative of economic success. The president's post claimed the administration was taking in trillions of dollars from these tariffs. It painted a picture of an economy with almost no inflation and a record stock market. This massive, allegedly unprecedented influx of revenue, the Post argued, would be so substantial that it could not only fund this $2,000 dividend, but also soon begin paying down our enormous debt, which the Post cited as $37 trillion. For political analysts and the public alike, the most critical part of this announcement was its definitive tone. This was the subject of immediate tone shift analysis. Commentators rapidly contrasted this new promise with a similar but failed proposal from earlier in the year, the Doge dividend. That earlier idea, which speculated on distributing savings from government efficiencies, had been floated with notably softer, more speculative language. The president had used phrases like "it may happen, we're thinking about it," and that it was a concept under consideration. The public and the media had correctly interpreted that language as exploratory and non committal. The November 9th announcement was fundamentally different. The language was deterministic. The Post used the declarative phrase, will be paid. It did not say might be paid or we are looking at. This linguistic shift from consideration to confirmation was profound. It moved the $2,000 check from the realm of political brainstorming to that of a direct presidential promise. This distinction was crucial. A president backing away from a consideration is politically routine, but failing to deliver on a direct promise carries significantly greater political peril. The line had been drawn, and the administration was now theoretically on the hook to deliver a $2,000 payment to millions of Americans. Now, you'd think a promise that big would have everyone in line, but that's not what happened. What we saw next was immediate administrative confusion and some serious critical backlash. The ink was barely dry on the digital post before the promise collided with the machinery of government and the skepticism of economic experts. The fallout was immediate, manifesting as both internal confusion within the administration and external evisceration from fiscal critics. The first sign of trouble came from the president's own Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent. As the administration's chief economic spokesman, Bessent was immediately inundated with questions from the financial press seeking clarification. His response was a masterclass in political backtracking. When questioned, Bessent candidly stated that he had not, in fact, spoken with the president about this specific plan. This admission alone was stunning, suggesting the $2,000 promise was a spur of the moment declaration rather than a carefully vetted administration policy. Forced to speculate on his boss's intentions, Besant immediately attempted to redefine the promise, suggesting the $2,000 dividend might not be a direct payment at all. He offered that it could come in lots of forms. The forms he cited were a collection of existing or proposed tax policies: the elimination of tax on tips, the removal of tax on overtime pay, the proposed ending of taxes on Social Security benefits, and the deductibility of auto loans. This walkback was politically disastrous. Besant's suggestions were fundamentally different from what the president had promised. A no tax on tips policy benefits a specific subset of the service industry, while a direct check benefits everyone from retirees to students to stay at home parents. The public had been promised a check, and the Treasury Secretary was now offering a complicated assortment of tax code adjustments. It created an immediate narrative of chaos and dissonance, implying either the president had misspoken or the Treasury was actively trying to kill the idea. While the administration fumbled its messaging, fiscal conservatives launched a full scale assault on the proposal's logic. The most potent criticism came from the Wall Street Journal editorial board, a powerful voice in conservative free market economics. The board's critique was not just ideological, it was mathematical. They lambasted the plan, labeling its central premise a logical fallacy. The fallacy, as the Wall Street Journal articulated, was one of basic arithmetic. The president had promised to do two things simultaneously: issue massive new stimulus checks, a new expenditure, and pay down the national debt, a massive reduction in liabilities. The board pointed out the glaring contradiction. The United States government was already running an annual federal budget deficit of approximately $1.8 trillion. In a deficit environment, all new revenue, including tariff revenue, is already spent. The government was not running a surplus. It was borrowing $1.8 trillion just to pay its existing bills. Therefore, any new revenue from tariffs was simply reducing the amount of new debt needed. It was not creating a pool of leftover cash. To both issue checks and pay down debt was a mathematical impossibility. One could not add a new spending program and reduce debt at the same time while already nearly $2 trillion in the red. The Wall Street Journal's criticism was stark. The numbers did not add up, and the promise was nonsensical. This brings us to the next day when the administration had to do damage control. This led to the clarification, which really highlighted the political motives behind the whole thing. Reeling from the internal confusion sparked by his Treasury Secretary and the external mockery from fiscal conservatives, President Trump responded the very next day. On Monday, November 10th, 2025, he returned to Truth Social to extinguish the fire and clarify his position, effectively doubling down on his original promise. This follow up post was a direct refutation of Scott Bessant's walkback. The president made it unequivocally clear that he was, in fact, talking about direct payments. His post explicitly referenced the $2,000 payments that will be made to low and middle income U.S. citizens. This language shut down Bessant's speculation about tax decreases or deductibility of auto loans. The promise was and remained a check. Furthermore, the Post attempted to solve the logical fallacy identified by the Wall Street Journal. It did so not by challenging the deficit numbers, but by creating a sequence of events. The Post read, all the money left over from the $2,000 payments will be used to substantially pay down the national debt. This new framing was clever. It implied the tariff revenue was so vast that it would first cover the entire $300 billion cost of the stimulus program, and only then, with the remaining substantial funds, would the administration begin to tackle the debt. While this sequencing provided a rhetorical solution, it did not solve the underlying mathematical problem. But the goal may not have been mathematical accuracy, it may have been political survival. The clarification on November 10th cemented the promise, silencing internal dissent and dismissing external criticism. The president had drawn his line in the sand. This fierce commitment to the promise, even in the face of logistical and mathematical chaos, pointed to powerful political motives. Analysis, particularly from publications like The Economist, suggested the move was a calculated effort to shore up a political base that was showing signs of erosion. The timing, with midterm elections looming, was critical. Reports indicated that the president was losing traction with several key demographics that had been instrumental in his previous successes. These groups included Arab Americans, Hispanic Americans, younger Americans, and women. These voting blocs, which had previously tilted toward his coalition, were now showing signs of drifting back toward the Democratic side. The $2,000 promise was interpreted by many analysts as a direct transactional appeal to these groups, a throw cash strategy to counter economic frustrations over inflation and cost of living. It was a bold populist move designed to recapture the economic narrative and energize voters by offering tangible, immediate financial relief, regardless of its long term feasibility. This move, however, did more than just target voters. It threw a spotlight on the deep and growing ideological civil war within the president's own party. The $2,000 check became a flashpoint, perfectly illustrating the conflict between the party's old guard and its new guard. The administrative confusion with Besant and the president offering contradictory messages was not merely a communications fumble, it was a symptom of this profound internal schism. On one side stood the traditional free market fiscal conservatives, the Dio Hao Thumb Hoot deficit hawks, represented by institutions like the Wall Street Journal editorial board. This wing of the party was built on a platform of limited government, fiscal responsibility, and free trade. To them, the promise of a $300 billion deficit financed stimulus program was anathema. It violated their core principles, representing the very kind of big government handout they had spent decades opposing. Their arguments were predictable and, from their perspective, logical. It would explode the deficit, dangerously stoke inflation, create a moral hazard by disincentivizing work, and ultimately be paid for by future generations. For them, the $38.1 trillion debt was a five alarm fire, and the president was suggesting using gasoline to put it out. On the other side was the ascendant populist nationalist wing of the party, a faction loyal not to an ideology but to the president himself. This group viewed economics through a different lens, not of free market purity, but of national interest and populist appeal. They saw that the base was struggling with high prices for groceries, gas, and rent. They were less concerned with the abstract dangers of the national debt and more focused on the tangible, immediate pain felt by their voters. To this wing, the $2,000 check was brilliant politics. It was a direct America First wealth transfer funded, at least in narrative, by foreign countries paying tariffs. It was a way to prove that the president was fighting for the little guy against a corrupt global system. Who cared if it added to the debt? The debt was already unpayable, an abstract number used by swamp creatures in Washington to justify austerity. This fundamental divide between the deficit hawks who wanted to shrink government and the populists who wanted to wield it was the primary reason the promise's legislative path was so treacherous. It wasn't just about getting Democratic votes. The president faced a rebellion from within his own ranks. The very fiscal hawks mentioned in legislative analyses were not a small fringe group. They were a powerful bloc of senators whose votes would be essential for any reconciliation bill. The promise of a $2,000 check forced them to choose: would they betray their decades long commitment to fiscal conservatism, or would they betray their party's leader? This internal conflict was the soft underbelly of the promise, a political vulnerability that opponents knew they could exploit and that made the path to passage, even with a majority, nearly impossible. But just because the promise was politically useful didn't mean it was possible. In fact, when you look at the feasibility, the plan faced a mountain of hurdles. Despite the president's renewed and clarified commitment, the $2,000 dividend faced a gauntlet of practical, non political hurdles. The plan was not just ambitious, it was, according to most experts, balanced precariously on a foundation of questionable math, legislative impossibilities, and dangerous economic consequences. Let's dig into that first, starting with the biggest hurdle, the math problem. This was all about revenue versus reality. The most significant hurdle was the one identified by the Wall Street Journal. The math simply did not work. The entire proposal was predicated on the claim of trillions of dollars in tariff revenue, a figure that bore no resemblance to official data. First, there was the cost of the checks themselves. While the high income cutoff was not defined, fiscal analysts at nonpartisan groups like the Tax Foundation quickly ran the numbers. Assuming a reasonable income cutoff of around $100,000 per person, the program would distribute checks to a massive portion of the populace. The estimated price tag for this one time dividend was staggering, approximately $300 billion. The administration claimed this $300 billion was a mere fraction of the incoming tariff revenue. The data, however, told a different story. The president's claim of trillions was a wild exaggeration. According to the administration's own Treasury Department, the most recently reported data for September 2025 showed tariff revenue at $31.6 billion. Even at that robust monthly rate, the annualized revenue would be approximately $380 billion a year. Other reports indicated that year to date collections for 2025 ranged from $195 billion to $214 billion. The conflict was clear. The absolute best case scenario for a full year of tariff revenue, $380 billion, was barely enough to cover the cost of the checks, $300 billion. It would leave virtually nothing left over to substantially pay down the national debt as the November 10th Post had promised. This problem was magnified exponentially by the deficit. The president's Post had cited the national debt as $37 trillion. This was itself an understatement. According to the Treasury Department's own website on November 9th, the actual national debt stood at $38.1 trillion. But the debt, the total amount owed, was less relevant than the deficit, the annual overspending. For fiscal year 2025, the government had a deficit of $1.78 trillion, often rounded to 1.8 trillion. Here, the plan collapsed. The government was already overspending by $1.78 trillion. The tariffs, generating only $380 billion, were not creating a profit. They were simply a drop in the bucket, slightly reducing the amount of new money the government had to borrow to stay open. The idea of siphoning $300 billion from that revenue stream to send checks would, in effect, simply add $300 billion to the deficit, requiring the Treasury to borrow that exact amount from markets. The tariff revenue was not new money, it was an accounting fiction, and there was no surplus to spend. But let's say, just for argument, that the math did work. They still had a huge legislative problem, and it all comes down to who holds the power of the purse. Even if the math had worked, the president faced a constitutional crisis. The power of the purse, the authority to appropriate and spend federal money, belongs exclusively to Congress. The president cannot, by himself, decide to send $300 billion to the American people. The plan would have to pass as a law. This presented three potential and equally unlikely legislative paths. The first path was standard legislation. This would require the bill to pass the House of Representatives and, crucially, gain 60 votes in the Senate to overcome a guaranteed filibuster. This was seen as a non starter. There was zero chance that enough opposition party senators would vote for a $300 billion stimulus package, especially given the inflationary concerns. The second, more plausible path was reconciliation. This is a special budgetary procedure that allows certain spending bills to bypass the 60 vote filibuster and pass the Senate with a simple majority of 51 votes, or 50, with the vice president breaking the tie. This is how the administration had passed other key financial bills. However, even this path was fraught. The administration's own party included a number of fiscal hawks, conservative senators who were ideologically opposed to massive deficit financed spending. Given the $1.8 trillion deficit and rampant inflation concerns, it was highly unlikely that the administration could rally all 50 of its own senators to support the measure. The third path, and the one most fraught with legal peril, was a direct executive order. There was some speculation the president might attempt this, citing a precedent where he had previously authorized a $300 per week unemployment benefit via executive action. However, that was a far smaller program, and its funding was achieved by redirecting existing, already appropriated disaster relief funds. A new $300 billion appropriation was a different beast entirely. Such an order would be a blatant violation of the separation of powers and would be immediately challenged and almost certainly struck down in court. And on top of all that, there was a massive economic problem fanning the flames of inflation. Finally, the plan faced a severe economic hurdle: inflation. The primary concern among economists, including many within the president's own party, was that injecting $300 billion of new demand into an already hot economy would be like pouring gasoline on a fire. The stimulus checks issued during the pandemic were widely credited with contributing to the subsequent inflationary spiral. The president's claim of almost 0% inflation was dismissed by all credible sources. Official federal government data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics reported the current inflation rate at 3.0%. Furthermore, Trueflation metrics, which many economists favor for real time data, suggested the actual rate experienced by consumers was closer to 6%. In this environment, a new round of checks would spike consumer demand for goods and services, driving prices even higher. This created a direct conflict with the administration's other major economic demand, that the Federal Reserve must cut interest rates. The Federal Reserve's entire mandate for raising rates was to cool inflation The president was simultaneously demanding the Fed cut rates and inflationary action while proposing a massive new stimulus check, another more direct inflationary action. The policies were in direct, irreconcilable conflict. This brings us to the final and maybe biggest hurdle, the Supreme Court risk. This wasn't just another problem, it was an existential threat to the entire idea. As if the mathematical, legislative, and economic hurdles were not high enough, the entire $2,000 promise was facing an existential threat from an entirely different branch of government, the judiciary, the very source of the funding of the tariff revenue itself, was the subject of a major high stakes case currently before the Supreme Court of the United States. The legal challenge, which had seen oral arguments heard on November 5th, 2025, did not question the amount of the tariffs, but the legality of their existence. The core of the case was a fundamental constitutional question. Did the president have the authority to impose these broad, sweeping tariffs unilaterally, or did they function as a tax, an authority that the Constitution reserves exclusively for Congress? Challengers argued that the president was illegally using an emergency law to claim nearly limitless tariff power. This pending Supreme Court decision, expected in the coming months, created two vastly different scenarios, both of which were perilous for the $2,000 check. The first and most devastating outcome would be if the Supreme Court ruled against the administration and struck down the tariffs. This would evaporate the plan instantly. According to legal experts, such a ruling would immediately force the administration to halt the tariffs, which would, in turn, cut in half the total tariff revenue being collected, likely to a figure well below $200 billion a year. This revenue stream would be insufficient to cover the $300 billion cost of the checks. Worse, the ruling could force the government to issue mass refunds to the importers who had paid the illegal tariffs, a sum estimated to be over $100 billion, further decimating the federal coffers. The second outcome was that the Supreme Court could rule in favor of the administration, upholding the legality of the tariffs. While this would be a political victory for the president, it would not authorize the $2,000 checks. It would merely confirm that the $380 billion revenue stream was legal. All of the other hurdles, the legislative problem, the mathematical deficit, and the inflation crisis, would remain. The administration would be back at square one, possessing a pool of money that was already spent by the deficit and holding a promise that Congress had no intention of letting them keep. In the end, the promise of a $2,000 dividend, launched with such certainty on November 9th, represented a perfect storm of political ambition and practical impossibility. It was a policy built on a foundation of disputed numbers, blocked by a resistant Congress, threatening to worsen an inflation crisis, and entirely dependent on a Supreme Court ruling that could erase its funding overnight. The check, so clear and tangible in a social media post, remained little more than a powerful and perhaps unattainable political idea.